The smell hit me before I even saw the pipe, a nauseating combination of raw sewage and chemical waste that made my eyes water as I hiked through the forest behind my cabin in northern Idaho. I had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for months, a chance to escape my demanding job as a senior inspector with the Environmental Protection Agency's Region 10 office in Seattle. Instead, here I was on Saturday morning, following a suspicious brown stream that definitely had not been there during my last visit 3 weeks ago. My name is Ivan Parker, and I have spent the last 14 years investigating environmental violations across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. I know what illegal dumping looks like, smells like, and sounds like. The low gurgling coming from somewhere up ahead was definitely the sound of an active discharge, and whatever was being released was contaminating the pristine creek that ran through this area. The same creek that fed into Lake Pandore, one of the deepest and cleanest lakes in the United States. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos, documenting the discolored water, the dead vegetation along the banks, and the white foam collecting in pools along the stream. The discharge was recent enough that the ecosystem had not fully adjusted yet. Small fish floated belly up in the shallows, and the usual chirping of birds had been replaced by an eerie silence. This was not just a minor leak or an accidental spill. This was systematic, deliberate dumping, and whoever was responsible was going to face serious consequences. Following the contaminated stream uphill, I pushed through dense underbrush and climbed over fallen logs, my hiking boots squelching in the wet ground. The forest here was supposed to be protected land, part of the reason I had purchased my cabin 5 years ago. The Pine Ridge Mountain community where my property was located had strict environmental regulations, or at least they were supposed to. The Homeowners Association had been very specific in their documentation about protecting the natural environment when I bought in. That is when I saw it. A 4-inch PVC pipe emerging from the hillside, partially concealed by hastily piled rocks and branches. The pipe was actively discharging a thick brown liquid that reeked of human waste and cleaning chemicals. I moved closer, careful not to contaminate my boots more than necessary, and examined the installation. This was not some ancient, forgotten septic system. The pipe was new, probably installed within the last 6 months based on the weathering and the lack of any significant algae growth. I took more photos, including close-ups of the pipe fittings and the manufacturer stamps. Then I carefully made my way around the discharge point, looking for any identifying markers or access points. About 20 feet uphill, I found what I was looking for, a concrete access hatch, partially hidden under dead leaves. Brushing away the debris, I found a metal plate stamped with Pine Ridge Mountain HOA Wastewater System 2025. My blood ran cold. The Homeowners Association. The same organization that had sent me 3 violation notices in the past year for letting my grass grow too long, for parking my truck in my driveway instead of my garage, and for hanging a bird feeder that was apparently not the approved style. The same HOA that charged every resident $1,200 a year in fees for community maintenance and environmental stewardship. They were dumping raw sewage directly into a protected watershed. I sat back on my heels, my mind racing through the implications. This was not just a violation of local ordinances. This was a federal crime under the Clean Water Act. If the HOA had installed an unpermitted wastewater discharge system, they were looking at fines of up to $50,000 per day, per violation. Given that this system appeared to have been operating for months, the penalties could easily reach into the millions. and if they had knowingly concealed this from state and federal regulators, there could be criminal charges as well. But I needed more information before I made any official moves. I was off duty on my own property, and technically, I had stumbled across this by accident. If I went in heavy-handed right now, a good lawyer could potentially argue that I had exceeded my authority or violated proper procedures. No, I needed to be smart about this. I needed documentation, evidence, and a clear chain of custody that would hold up in court. I spent the next hour carefully surveying the area, taking GPS coordinates, collecting water samples in the bottles I had brought for drinking water, and documenting everything with photos and detailed notes on my phone. The discharge point was approximately 3/4 of a mile from my cabin, on what appeared to be HOA common property. The contaminated stream flowed another half-mile before joining the main creek that fed into the lake. As I worked, I heard voices approaching from uphill. I quickly stepped behind a large Douglas fir, not wanting to be seen until I understood who was coming. 2 men emerged from the trees, both wearing work clothes and carrying tools. They walked directly to the discharge point and began examining the pipe. "Flow looks steady," one of them said, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a graying beard. "Should handle the increased load from the new development." "Yeah, but Greg is worried about someone noticing," the other replied, younger, maybe early 30s. "Especially with that EPA guy who lives down on Ridgewood Drive." My cabin was on Ridgewood Drive. They were talking about me. "Parker, he is never here. Besides, even if he did notice, what is he going to do?" "This is private property, and the HOA has the right to manage its own wastewater," the older man said. "That is what Brenda told the board anyway." Brenda. That would be Brenda Sullivan, the HOA president and the woman who had personally delivered 2 of my 3 violation notices. A woman in her mid-50s with an aggressive management style, and a reputation for expanding the HOA's authority at every opportunity. I had heard other residents complain about her at the few community meetings I had attended, but she always had enough support from the board to do whatever she wanted. "I do not know, Tom. This does not feel right. We are dumping thousands of gallons a day straight into the ground." "What if it gets into the lake?" the younger man said. "Then it gets into the lake. We are miles away, and by the time it reaches Pandora, it will be so diluted nobody will notice." "Look, do you want the HOA to spend $2 million on a proper treatment facility, or do you want your fees to stay reasonable? Because those are the options," Tom replied. I carefully recorded their conversation on my phone, making sure to capture their voices clearly. This was getting better by the minute. Not only did I have physical evidence of the illegal discharge, but I now had recorded admissions that the HOA knew exactly what they were doing and had chosen to dump rather than pay for proper treatment. The 2 men spent another 10 minutes checking the system, making some adjustments to the rocks concealing the pipe, and then headed back uphill. I waited until their voices faded completely before emerging from my hiding spot. I needed to see where that pipe led, and I needed to find out exactly how big this operation was. Following the hillside up, I stayed parallel to where I estimated the pipe would run. The terrain got steeper, and I had to grab onto branches and roots to pull myself up the slope. After about a 1/4 mile, I emerged into a clearing that had been cut into the forest. In the center stood a large concrete structure, maybe 30 feet across, with multiple pipes leading into it from different directions. A chain-link fence surrounded the facility, with Pine Ridge Mountain HOA authorized personnel-only signs posted every few feet. Through the fence, I could see the setup clearly. This was a collection system, gathering wastewater from multiple sources and funneling it to the discharge point I had found below. There were no treatment components visible, no aeration tanks, no clarifiers, nothing that would actually process the sewage. It was just a holding and distribution system designed to dump raw waste into the environment. I took extensive photos of the facility, the fence, the signs, and every pipe I could see. Then I noticed something else. A small building next to the main structure, probably a pump house or control room. The door was secured with a padlock, but through the grimy window, I could see a control panel and what looked like monitoring equipment. This was a sophisticated system, probably designed and installed by actual engineers. This was not some accidental code violation or a shortcut taken by an ignorant contractor. Someone had deliberately designed a system to dispose of wastewater by dumping it directly into the environment, and they had done so knowing it was illegal. The HOA had not just violated environmental regulations. They had conspired to do so, and they had spent significant money to build the infrastructure to support that conspiracy. I was so focused on examining the facility that I almost did not hear the ATV approaching. The engine whine gave me just enough warning to duck back into the tree line before a four-wheeler emerged from a trail on the far side of the clearing. Riding it was Brenda Sullivan herself, wearing designer sunglasses and a crisp polo shirt with the Pine Ridge Mountain logo embroidered on the chest. She stopped the ATV next to the fence and got off, pulling out a key to open the gate. She walked directly to the pump house, unlocked it, and went inside. Through the window, I could see her checking gauges and writing notes on a clipboard. She was clearly familiar with the system, checking it regularly, maintaining operational awareness. This was not something being done behind her back by rogue contractors. The HOA president was directly involved in the illegal operation. After about 5 minutes, Brenda emerged from the pump house, locked it back up, and stood with her hands on her hips, surveying the facility with evident satisfaction. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. "Greg, it is Brenda. I am at the facility now. Everything looks good. Flow rates are normal, and we are well within capacity even with the 20 new units coming online next month," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Yes, I know Parker is in town this weekend. I saw his truck at his cabin. But he has no reason to come up here, and even if he did, he would not understand what he was looking at. The system is clearly marked as HOA property, and we have every right to manage our infrastructure however we see fit." There was a pause as she listened to whoever Greg was on the other end. "No, I am not worried about permits. We are not discharging into any navigable waters. That creek is entirely on our property until it leaves our boundaries, and what happens after that is not our responsibility. I have talked to our lawyer, and he assures me we are on solid legal ground," she continued. "The cost savings are worth it. We are saving every homeowner here thousands of dollars by not building an unnecessary treatment plant to satisfy some bureaucrat's interpretation of regulations that do not even apply to us." I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to step out and confront her right then. The arrogance was staggering. The ignorance of environmental law was almost impressive in its completeness. The Clean Water Act did not just cover navigable waters in the way she seemed to think. Any discharge of pollutants that could reasonably reach waters of the United States was regulated, and the creek she was dumping into absolutely qualified. And the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permitting requirements were not optional for anyone, including homeowners associations. Brenda finished her call, got back on her ATV, and drove off the way she had come. I waited until the sound of the engine completely disappeared before moving. I had seen and heard enough for now. It was time to go back to my cabin, secure my evidence, and start building an official case. The hike back down the mountain gave me time to think through my next steps. As a federal inspector, I had a duty to report environmental crimes, but I also had to follow proper procedures. I could not just show up at the HOA office on Monday morning and start making arrests. I needed to coordinate with the EPA's Enforcement Division, notify the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, and potentially involve the FBI if we were going to pursue criminal charges beyond just civil penalties. But I also needed to be careful. Brenda had specifically mentioned me during her phone call, which meant the HOA was aware of my profession and was potentially monitoring my activities. If they realized I had discovered their illegal dumping operation, they might try to shut it down and destroy evidence before I could build a complete case. I needed to move quickly but carefully. Back at my cabin, I transferred all my photos and recordings to my laptop and backed everything up to a secure cloud server. Then, I started drafting a formal incident report, documenting everything I had observed with timestamps and GPS coordinates. This would be the foundation of the case, my initial observation that would trigger the official investigation. It was Saturday afternoon, which meant I had at least a day before I could contact anyone at the EPA office. I thought about calling the emergency response hotline, but this was not an emergency in the immediate sense. The discharge had clearly been ongoing for months, and another day or two would not make a significant difference to the overall environmental impact. What mattered more was building an airtight case that would lead to actual consequences, not just a hasty response that might let the HOA wiggle out of responsibility. I spent the rest of Saturday gathering more evidence. I hiked downstream, collecting water samples at various points, documenting the contamination plume, and noting impacts on vegetation and wildlife. I found 3 more dead fish, 2 dead frogs, and an entire section of creek where the aquatic insects that normally thrived in this environment were completely absent. The ecological damage was significant and growing. Sunday morning, I was sitting on my cabin's back deck, reviewing my notes and preparing for the week ahead, when I heard a knock at my front door. I walked through the cabin and opened it to find Brenda Sullivan standing there with another woman I recognized as Linda Morrison, the HOA vice president. Both wore fake smiles that did not reach their eyes. "Mr. Parker, how wonderful to see you. We noticed you were in town this weekend and thought we should stop by to discuss a few community matters," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false friendliness. "What matters would those be?" I asked, not inviting them in. "Well, we have received some complaints about your property. Your cabin's exterior paint is fading, which violates our community standards. And we noticed you have not been maintaining the drainage around your foundation, which could lead to erosion issues," Linda said, consulting a tablet. I looked at her blankly. My cabin's paint was less than 3 years old and looked fine, and the drainage around my property was professionally installed and working perfectly. These were completely fabricated complaints. "I will take that under advisement," I said evenly. "We are going to need you to address these issues within 30 days, or we will have to assess fines. $500 per violation per month until compliance is achieved," Brenda added. "We wanted to give you fair warning since you are so rarely here to receive our official notices." "Is there anything else?" I asked. "Actually, yes. We are expanding our wastewater management facilities to serve the new development, and we may need to run some lines near your property. We will need you to sign an easement allowing HOA access to the land behind your cabin," Brenda said, pulling out a document. "It is just a formality, really." All the other residents on this road have already signed. I took the document and scanned it quickly. It was not just an easement for access. It was a blanket waiver granting the HOA permission to install and operate any infrastructure they deemed necessary, without notification, and without any liability for damages or environmental impacts. Signing this would essentially give them permission to do whatever they wanted on my property, including potentially extending their illegal dumping operation. "I will have my lawyer review this," I said, handing it back. Brenda's smile tightened. "Your lawyer?" "Mr. Parker, this is a standard community agreement. Everyone else has signed without issue." "Then I am sure you will not mind waiting while I have it reviewed. I never sign legal documents without proper consideration," I replied. "We need this signed by the end of the month, or we will have to take other measures. The community's needs must come before individual preferences," Linda said, an edge creeping into her voice. As I said, I will have my lawyer review it. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to do," I said and closed the door without waiting for a response. Through the window, I watched them return to Brenda's luxury SUV, their body language showing clear agitation. They sat in the vehicle for several minutes, obviously discussing something heatedly, before finally driving off. The timing of their visit was not coincidental. They were worried I had discovered something, and they were trying to either intimidate me into compliance or get me to sign away my rights to object to their activities. That afternoon, I drove into Sandpoint, the nearest town of any size, and bought a wildlife camera. Back at the cabin, I hiked back up to the discharge point and mounted the camera in a tree with a clear view of the pipe and the access hatch. I set it to take photos every hour and to record any motion in the area. If anyone came to service or modify the system, I would have a record. Monday morning, I was up at dawn and on the road back to Seattle by 6. I needed to be in the office to start the formal process, and I wanted to get there early before anyone could interfere. The 5-hour drive gave me plenty of time to rehearse how I would present my findings. This was not going to be a typical case. I was the complainant, the initial investigator, and technically the victim, since my property was in the affected area. I would need to recuse myself from the official investigation to avoid any appearance of impropriety, but I could still provide my initial findings and evidence to the team that would take over. I arrived at the EPA's Region 10 office in downtown Seattle just after 11 and went directly to my supervisor's office. Martha Henderson was a 25-year veteran of the agency and one of the toughest environmental prosecutors in the Pacific Northwest. If anyone would appreciate the magnitude of what I had found, it was her. "Ivan, you are supposed to be on leave through Wednesday," she said when I appeared in her doorway. "I need to file an immediate incident report and request an emergency investigation team," I said, closing the door behind me. "I have discovered a significant unpermitted discharge operation in Idaho, and it involves my HOA. Martha's expression shifted from confused to focused in an instant. "Sit down and tell me everything." I spent the next hour walking her through my findings, showing her the photos, playing the recordings, and laying out the evidence I had gathered. Martha took notes, asked pointed questions, and occasionally shook her head in disbelief at the brazenness of what the HOA had done. "This is incredible. They built an entire collection system and have been operating it for months without any permits, without any environmental review, without even trying to hide what they were doing beyond some basic concealment of the discharge point," she said. "Do they actually think they are exempt from federal environmental law?" Based on what I overheard, yes. Brenda Sullivan seems to believe that because the creek is on their property, they can do whatever they want with it. And their lawyer apparently told them they were on solid legal ground, I explained. Then their lawyer is incompetent, complicit, or both. This is a textbook Clean Water Act violation. Multiple violations, actually. Unpermitted discharge, discharge of pollutants, false statements to regulators if they filed any paperwork at all claiming compliance. Martha ticked off on her fingers. And depending on what we find when we dig deeper, possible conspiracy charges, if we can prove they deliberately concealed this from state and federal authorities. What is our next move? I asked. First, you are officially recused from this investigation as of right now. You can provide your initial report and evidence, but that is it. I am going to assign this to Carl's team. They have been light on cases this month, and they are good at corporate malfeasance, which is essentially what this is, Martha said. Second, I am going to contact Idaho DEQ and the FBI. The state needs to be involved since this is happening in their jurisdiction, and the FBI may be interested if we are looking at criminal conspiracy charges. How long before we can move on this? I am worried they might realize I am onto them and try to shut everything down, I said. That is a valid concern, but we need to do this right. I am going to expedite everything I can, but we are still looking at probably 2 weeks before we can get a team on the ground with proper warrants and legal authority. In the meantime, I want you to stay away from your cabin. Do not go back. Do not contact anyone from the HOA. Do not do anything that might tip them off or compromise the investigation, Martha instructed. I nodded, though part of me wanted to be there when the hammer fell. But Martha was right. I had done my part by discovering and documenting the violations. Now I needed to let the system work. Over the next week, things moved faster than I expected. Martha brought in Carl Strickland and his team, who reviewed my evidence and immediately began building a broader case. They subpoenaed records from the HOA, pulled building permits from Bonner County, and interviewed contractors who had worked on the property. What they found was even worse than I had initially discovered. The HOA had started the illegal discharge system 3 years ago, not months. They had been dumping untreated sewage into the environment for over 1,000 days, which meant potential penalties starting at $50 million. They had submitted false compliance reports to the state, claiming they were using a licensed and permitted waste hauler to remove sewage, when in fact, they had been dumping it directly into the creek. And perhaps most damning, internal HOA emails showed that multiple board members, including Brenda Sullivan, had been explicitly warned by an environmental consultant that their plan was illegal, and they had proceeded anyway. They ignored expert advice telling them this was a federal crime and did it anyway because it saved money. That is going to play very well when we get to prosecution, Carl told me during one of the briefings I was allowed to attend as the initial reporting party. The Idaho Department of Environmental Quality was even more aggressive than the EPA. They issued an immediate cease and desist order, filed for emergency injunctive relief to shut down the discharge, and started their own criminal investigation. The state took environmental crime seriously, especially when they involved water resources as important as Lake Pendore. 2 weeks after my initial report, on a Thursday morning, a convoy of government vehicles rolled into Pine Ridge Mountain. EPA investigators, Idaho DEQ officers, and FBI agents served warrants on the HOA office, on Brenda Sullivan's home, and on the illegal discharge facility. They shut down the system, tagged everything as evidence, and began interviewing witnesses. I watched it all happen via updates from Carl. I was still in Seattle, still recused from the official investigation, but I made sure to stay informed. The HOA's response was predictable. Deny everything, claim they had relied on legal advice, insist they had no idea what they were doing was wrong. But the evidence was overwhelming. The emails, the recordings, the physical infrastructure, it all pointed to a deliberate, sustained violation of federal and state environmental law. The real turning point came when investigators interviewed the younger contractor I had overheard, whose name turned out to be Jason Whitmore. Faced with potential criminal charges himself, Jason flipped immediately. He provided detailed testimony about how the HOA had approached him and his Uncle Tom to build the system, how they had specifically instructed him not to file for permits, and how Brenda Sullivan had personally overseen the construction to make sure it was cost-effective, which apparently meant dumping raw sewage into the forest. With Jason's testimony, the case against the HOA board became criminal, not just civil. The FBI arrested Brenda Sullivan, the HOA vice president Linda Morrison, the treasurer Greg Matheson, who I had heard mentioned in phone calls, and 2 other board members on charges of conspiracy to violate environmental law, false statements to federal officers, and wire fraud related to the false reports they had submitted to the state. The arrests made regional news. HOA leaders arrested for illegal dumping operation was the headline in the Spokane Spokesman Review. The story detailed how the Pine Ridge Mountain HOA had saved over $2 million by building an illegal sewage system instead of a proper treatment facility, and how residents had been unknowingly paying fees for environmental stewardship, while the board was actually poisoning the local watershed. The residents of Pine Ridge Mountain were, predictably, furious. An emergency meeting was called, the remaining board members were removed, and an interim board was elected to clean up the mess. I received dozens of calls and emails from neighbors apologizing, thanking me, and asking what they could do to help remediate the environmental damage. 3 weeks after the arrests, I finally returned to my cabin. The discharge point had been properly sealed, and the EPA had installed a monitoring station to track recovery of the creek ecosystem. The illegal facility had been dismantled, and a proper environmental engineering firm had been contracted to design a legitimate wastewater treatment system for the community. I hiked up to where the discharge point had been and found clear water running through the creek for the first time in 3 years. Small fish were already returning, and the vegetation along the banks was beginning to recover. It would take years for the ecosystem to fully heal, but the immediate threat was over. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Brenda Sullivan and the other board members initially tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was too strong. Jason Whitmore's testimony, combined with the emails and my recordings, left no room for reasonable doubt. Eventually, all 5 defendants accepted plea agreements. Brenda Sullivan received 2 years in federal prison, 3 years supervised release, and a personal fine of $250,000. Linda Morrison and Greg Matheson each got 18 months and significant fines. The other 2 board members, who had been less directly involved, received probation and community service. The HOA itself faced civil penalties totaling $47 million, reduced to $18 million as part of the settlement agreement. The association had to establish a remediation fund, conduct extensive environmental restoration work, and submit to 5 years of enhanced monitoring and reporting to both the EPA and Idaho DEQ. Insurance covered some of the costs, but the residents of Pine Ridge Mountain faced special assessments totaling tens of thousands of dollars, each to pay for the proper wastewater system that should have been built in the first place. I attended the sentencing hearing for Brenda Sullivan. I wanted to see justice served in person. She stood before the federal judge in boys, her designer clothes replaced by a prison jumpsuit, her arrogance replaced by tears and apologies that rang hollow after everything she had done. The judge was not sympathetic. "Mrs. Sullivan, you were entrusted with the responsibility of managing a community and protecting the environment that made that community desirable. Instead, you chose to poison that environment to save money and enhance your own reputation as a fiscally responsible leader. You ignored expert advice, violated federal law, and then lied to regulators to cover up your crimes. The damage you caused will take years to repair, and the cost to your community has been devastating. The sentence of this court reflects the seriousness of your actions and the need to deter others who might consider similar conduct." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a sense of completion. I had bought a cabin in Idaho to escape the stress of my job, to have a place where I could relax and enjoy nature. Instead, I had uncovered one of the most egregious environmental crimes in the region's recent history. But in doing so, I had protected the watershed, held criminals accountable, and sent a message that environmental laws applied to everyone, even homeowners associations that thought they were above federal authority. Back at Pine Ridge Mountain, things slowly returned to normal, or at least a new normal. The community elected a new board committed to transparency and actual environmental stewardship. The proper wastewater treatment facility was completed 18 months after the arrests, a state-of-the-art system that actually cleaned the water instead of dumping it into the forest. And my neighbors stopped giving me suspicious looks and started treating me like someone who had done the community a favor, even if that favor came with a hefty price tag. I still received occasional updates from Carl about the case. The environmental restoration work was progressing well. Water quality in the creek had improved significantly, and fish populations were rebounding faster than anyone had expected. The monitoring station would remain in place for at least 5 more years, but early indications were that the ecosystem would recover fully within a decade. One Saturday morning, almost 2 years after I first noticed the smell in the forest, I hiked back up to the site where the discharge point had been. The forest had reclaimed the area. The pipe was gone, properly removed and disposed of. The creek ran clear and cold, with native cutthroat trout visible in the pools. Birds sang in the trees, and dragonflies patrolled the water's edge. It looked like it had before the HOA had decided that saving money was more important than protecting the environment. I sat on a rock beside the creek and thought about how differently things could have gone. If I had not been an EPA inspector, if I had not known what to look for and how to document it, the illegal discharge might have continued for years. The damage would have been worse, potentially irreparable. The HOA board would have gotten away with their crimes, emboldened to cut other corners and violate other laws in pursuit of cost savings and personal power. But I had been there, with the knowledge and the authority to do something about it. And I had. It was not the relaxing weekend retreat I had envisioned when I bought the cabin, but it was something more important. It was justice, both environmental and legal. It was accountability for people who thought they were above the law. And it was a reminder that expertise mattered, that experience mattered, that having the right person in the right place at the right time could make all the difference. The legal aftermath continued to ripple outward. The case became a teaching example at EPA training sessions. showing inspectors how to properly document environmental crimes and build cases that would hold up in court. The Idaho state legislature passed new laws specifically addressing HOA oversight and environmental compliance, requiring associations over a certain size to have their infrastructure plans reviewed by state environmental officials. And several other communities in the region, after seeing what happened at Pine Ridge Mountain, voluntarily came forward to report potential compliance issues with their own wastewater systems, leading to corrections before they became criminal matters. For me personally, the case boosted my reputation within the agency. I had always been considered a solid, reliable inspector, but now I was seen as someone who could handle complex, high-stakes investigations. Martha hinted that a promotion might be in my future, possibly moving into a supervisory role where I could mentor younger investigators. I was not sure I wanted the administrative responsibilities that came with that, but it was nice to be recognized. The impact on Brenda Sullivan and the other board members was far more severe and lasting. Beyond their prison time and fines, they all faced civil lawsuits from residents who wanted compensation for the decreased property values and special assessments that resulted from the board's actions. Insurance covered some of those claims, but Brenda personally ended up declaring bankruptcy, losing her home in the community she had once ruled with such arrogance. I tried not to take satisfaction in her downfall, but it was hard not to feel that justice had been appropriately served. She had broken the law deliberately, ignored warnings, lied to regulators, and endangered public health and the environment, all to save money and appear to be an effective manager. The consequences she faced were entirely proportional to her actions. The wildlife camera I had installed to monitor the discharge point had captured some interesting footage during the investigation period. It showed Tom and Jason visiting the site multiple times, showed Brenda making her rounds to check the system, and even captured an Idaho DEQ officer examining the area during a routine watershed survey, though he had apparently not noticed the illegal discharge, possibly because the HOA had gotten lucky with timing, or because they had seen him coming and temporarily shut down the pumps. Carl had used that footage effectively during the prosecution, showing the systematic nature of the operation and the direct involvement of board members. What struck me most, looking back on the entire experience, was how ordinary people could convince themselves that breaking the law was acceptable if the reason seemed good enough. Brenda and her board colleagues were not criminal masterminds. They were middle-class suburbanites who had gotten elected to a volunteer position, and then decided that keeping costs down justified ignoring environmental regulations. They had rationalized their actions, convinced themselves they were doing what was best for the community, and ignored any evidence that contradicted their desired conclusion. It was a lesson I had learned many times in my career. Ordinary people commit environmental crimes every day, usually not out of malice but out of convenience, cost savings, or simple ignorance. The difference was that most of them did not have access to hundreds of thousands of dollars in HOA funds to build sophisticated illegal infrastructure. Brenda and her board had taken the typical environmental crime and scaled it up, making it worse through their resources and their determination to avoid proper compliance. During the community meetings that followed the scandal, I had tried to explain to residents how the Clean Water Act worked, why permits were necessary, and what proper environmental stewardship actually looked like. Many of them had been genuinely ignorant of the regulations, assuming that if the HOA said something was legal, it must be. It was a reminder of how much trust people place in institutions and elected leaders, and how devastating that betrayal could be when those leaders proved unworthy of that trust. The new HOA board, led by a retired engineer named Robert Finley, approached environmental compliance with almost religious fervor. They hired consultants to review every aspect of the community's operations, obtained permits for things that had been operating in gray areas, and established a transparency policy that required board meetings to be recorded and made available to all residents. It was perhaps an overcorrection, but it was understandable given what had happened. Robert contacted me several times during the transition, asking for advice on environmental best practices and how to ensure the community never found itself in similar trouble again. I appreciated his diligence and helped where I could, though I was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. I was a resident and a concerned neighbor, but I was also a federal official, and I could not be seen as giving preferential treatment or acting as an informal consultant beyond what I would do for any community. The proper wastewater treatment facility, when it was finally completed, was actually impressive. It used modern membrane bioreactor technology, producing effluent clean enough to use for irrigation, which the community did for the common areas and the golf course that served the development. Ironically, the system was far more sophisticated and environmentally friendly than what would have been required by regulation. The HOA had gone from one extreme to the other, from criminal dumping to cutting-edge treatment technology. The cost, of course, had been staggering. Between the legal penalties, the remediation work, the proper facility construction, and the legal fees, the total bill to the community exceeded $30 million. Spread across the 200 residences, that meant every homeowner faced assessments averaging $150,000 over 5 years, on top of their regular HOA fees. Some residents ended up selling their properties, unable or unwilling to pay. Property values in Pine Ridge Mountain dropped significantly as the scandal became public and the financial burden became clear. I felt guilty about that, even though intellectually I knew I had done the right thing. My actions had cost my neighbors huge amounts of money and disrupted the community I had joined. But the alternative would have been allowing the illegal dumping to continue, causing greater environmental damage and eventually leading to an even bigger scandal when it was inevitably discovered by someone else. And the damage to property values would have been even worse if the lake itself had been seriously contaminated, which was the likely eventual outcome if the discharge had continued unchecked. Several neighbors expressed those exact sentiments to me over the months that followed. They thanked me, said they understood I had been doing my job, and acknowledged that the short-term pain was better than the long-term disaster that had been brewing. Not everyone felt that way. I definitely received some hostile looks at community gatherings, and one person left an angry note on my truck, complaining that I should have minded my own business, but the majority of residents seemed to understand the situation. The media attention was intense for several months, but eventually faded as other stories took over the news cycle. I gave a few interviews, carefully coordinated with the EPA's Public Affairs Office, explaining what I had found and why environmental regulations existed. I tried to use the opportunity to educate the public about the Clean Water Act and the importance of proper wastewater management, turning a local scandal into a teaching moment. One interview that stuck with me was with a reporter from the Coeur d'Alene Press who asked whether I regretted buying the cabin, given all the trouble it had brought. I had thought about that question myself many times. My peaceful mountain retreat had turned into a crime scene, a legal battle, and a community crisis. But I told the reporter honestly, no, I did not regret it. The cabin was still beautiful, the forest was recovering, and I had been in a position to stop serious environmental harm. If I had to do it all over again, I would make the same choices. That interview ran with a photo of me standing beside the creek where the discharge had been, clear water flowing behind me, and the headline EPA inspector says environmental protection worth personal cost. It was more dramatic than I would have chosen, but the sentiment was accurate. My job was not always convenient, and sometimes it required personal sacrifice, but it mattered. Protecting the environment mattered. Holding violators accountable mattered. And I was proud to be part of that effort, even when it complicated my personal life. As time passed and the immediate crisis receded, I settled into a new routine at the cabin. I visited less frequently at first, partly due to work demands and partly due to lingering awkwardness in the community. But gradually, as the treatment facility came online and life returned to normal, I started spending more weekends there again. The forest was as beautiful as ever, the air was clean, and the creek ran clear. It was still the retreat I had wanted, just with a more complicated history than I had anticipated. I also made a point of hiking up to the monitoring station regularly, checking the data and watching the ecosystem recovery. It became a source of personal satisfaction, seeing the tangible results of my actions. The fish populations grew. The vegetation flourished. The water quality improved year by year. Environmental restoration was possible when people took responsibility and did the work required. The case remained open officially for years, as the court-ordered monitoring and restoration continued. I received annual reports from the EPA and Idaho DEQ, tracking progress and documenting compliance. Brenda Sullivan served her full sentence, and I heard through community gossip that she moved out of state after her release, starting over somewhere where nobody knew her history. The other board members similarly served their time and faded from public view. The Pine Ridge mountain community itself recovered more quickly than the ecosystem did. Property values stabilized and even began to increase again as the scandal receded into the past, and the new, proper infrastructure became a selling point rather than a source of shame. The community rebranded itself slightly, emphasizing environmental responsibility and transparency in its marketing to potential new residents. Robert Finley and his board served multiple terms, bringing stability and competent management after years of Brenda Sullivan's corruption. I eventually developed friendships with several neighbors who had been supportive throughout the ordeal. We hiked together, shared meals, and commiserated about HOA politics and the costs we all bore for the previous board's crimes. It was oddly bonding, going through a crisis together and coming out the other side. We had all lost money and endured stress, but we had also learned about environmental law, proper governance, and the importance of accountability. Looking back on the entire experience from the perspective of several years later, I realized it had changed me in subtle but important ways. I had always taken my work seriously, but I had thought of it as something separate from my personal life. The cabin was supposed to be my escape from being EPA Inspector Ivan Parker, a place where I could just be Ivan, a guy who liked hiking and fishing and quiet weekends in the mountains. But the case taught me that expertise is not something you can turn off. I was an EPA inspector whether I was in the office in Seattle or at my cabin in Idaho. My knowledge and training were part of who I was, and pretending otherwise was neither possible nor desirable. And when I encountered violations, I had a responsibility to act, regardless of where I was or what it meant for my personal life. That realization was empowering in some ways and burdensome in others. It meant I could never fully escape my job, never completely disconnect from the work and the responsibilities that came with it. But it also meant that I could make a difference anywhere, that my skills and knowledge had value beyond my official duties, and that being an environmental professional was not just a job but a calling. The cabin remained my retreat, but it was now a retreat with purpose. I spent time there enjoying nature, but I also spent time observing, monitoring, and staying aware of potential environmental issues. I joined the local watershed association, volunteered with creek cleanup efforts, and became an informal resource for neighbors with environmental questions. I turned the disruption of discovering illegal dumping into an opportunity to be more engaged with the community and the environment I had moved there to enjoy. Carl Strickland told me during one of our periodic check-ins that the Pine Ridge Mountain case had become legendary within the EPA. It was held up as an example of how investigations should be conducted, how evidence should be gathered, and how even off-duty inspectors could make crucial contributions to environmental protection. He said new recruits learned about my initial discovery and documentation during their training, studying what I had done right and how they could apply those lessons to their own work. I was simultaneously proud and embarrassed by that recognition. I had just been doing what any competent inspector would do in that situation. But apparently, the combination of being personally affected, maintaining professional objectivity, and gathering evidence that led to criminal convictions was noteworthy enough to become a teaching tool. It was a strange form of immortality, knowing that my actions on that Saturday morning when I smelled sewage in the forest would be studied by EPA inspectors for years to come. The environmental consultant who had warned the HOA board that their plan was illegal also played an interesting role in the aftermath. His warnings, documented in emails that became evidence, protected him from any liability and actually enhanced his reputation. He became something of a local expert on HOA environmental compliance, hired by associations throughout the region to review their operations and ensure they were not headed down the same path as Pine Ridge Mountain. He contacted me once to thank me for exposing the violations, saying it vindicated his professional advice and validated the importance of hiring qualified consultants rather than just doing what seemed cheapest. The broader impact of the case on HOA governance was harder to measure but potentially significant. Several states, not just Idaho, passed new laws requiring environmental reviews of HOA infrastructure projects, mandatory transparency in board operations, and enhanced liability for board members who knowingly violated regulations. Professional associations for community managers added environmental compliance to their training and certification programs. Insurance companies began requiring environmental audits as a condition of coverage for large associations. All of that happened because Brenda Sullivan and her board decided to save money by dumping sewage in a creek, and because I happened to smell it during a weekend visit to my cabin. It was a reminder of how individual actions, both criminal and law-abiding, could ripple outward in unexpected ways, changing systems and protecting people and places far beyond the immediate situation. In the end, my cabin in Idaho became more than just a weekend retreat. It became the site of one of the most significant cases of my career, the place where I learned that environmental protection never took a day off, and a constant reminder of why the work I did mattered. Every time I visited, every time I hiked past the creek that now ran clean and clear, I felt a sense of accomplishment that no office commendation or professional award could match. I had found illegal dumping in my own backyard, and I had stopped it. I had held powerful people accountable for their crimes, protected a beautiful ecosystem, and helped ensure that no one else would poison that watershed for profit or convenience. It was not the peaceful mountain experience I had envisioned when I bought the property, but it was something better. It was justice, environmental and legal, and it was the culmination of everything my career had trained me to do. The cabin still stands, my retreat and my reminder. The creek still flows, clean and protected. And somewhere in EPA training rooms in Seattle and across the country, new inspectors still learn about the case, about what to look for and how to document it, about the importance of never assuming that violations only happen in industrial settings or far from home. Sometimes, environmental crimes happen in places we love, carried out by people we know, and it takes knowledge, courage, and commitment to stop them. I had all three when I needed them most, and that made all the difference.